Try that again. Story is told of many years ago in South Korea. Two soldiers had hired a young, educated man to cook for them. Well, these two soldiers loved to play practical jokes on this young cook. And so one day they put Vaseline on the stove handles, and the next day when the young man attempted to turn on the stove, his fingers slipped off the handles because of the Vaseline. Another occasion, the soldiers did that old trick of putting a bucket of water over the door, and so that when this young man entered the kitchen, he got drenched. They even went as far as one time nailing his boots to the floor. I mean, it's creative. Well, as a result, he had to remove all the nails in order to put on his boots and leave for the day. The young man never said anything. He was quiet, and he peacefully did his job of cooking for these two soldiers. Well, as time passed, the practical jokes were getting old, and the two soldiers were actually starting to feel a little guilty for what they had done to this young man. So they went to this young cook and apologized and promised to stop these practical jokes. The young man replied, no more slippy stuff on the stove? No more slippy stuff on the stove. No more water on the door? No more water on the door. No more boots stuck to the floor? No more boots stuck to the floor. Okay, the young man said with a smile, then no more spit in your soup. Oh, sweet revenge, right? Or to quote Alfred Hitchcock, revenge is sweet and non-fattening. It's been said revenge is the greatest instinct in the human race. Well, Jesus chimes in on this matter of revenge and retaliation. Look with me at Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, as we continue looking at the greatest sermon ever, the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus' words in Matthew 5, verses 38 through 48, bring us really to the midpoint of this great sermon. And this morning is the last two of the 6 statements that were introduced with the words, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." And what they had heard it said by the Pharisees and the teachers of the law was a misuse of the Old Testament, and Jesus is bringing a corrective to their understanding in these 6 statements. And the series of 6 statements that began really back in verse 21 of Matthew 5 was just after the words in Matthew 5 verse 20, that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now, the Pharisees misapplied the Old Testament teaching, and they wrongly believed and taught that the way to God was through religious rituals and traditions. Their focus was on the outer life, kind of, and mostly, while neglecting, for sure, the inner, deeper stuff inside their lives. And with these 6 statements, Jesus points to a different way, a better way. He speaks of a righteousness that we cannot attain on our own, but can only come to those who recognize they do fall short of what God requires. We come to Him poor in spirit. We come to Him recognizing we are spiritually bankrupt, so that we can then fall on our face before God and receive His mercy. And then citizens of His kingdom are given a new heart. We're given a new heart. Those who live under the rule of Jesus have a superseding righteousness that turns the religious establishment in Jesus' day on its head. See, Jesus' way, I think it's pretty obvious here, and it's going to be even more so this morning. Jesus' way is counterintuitive. Jesus is assuming that something very profound, extraordinary happens in people who live the way the Sermon on the Mount calls them to live. This is never more obvious than what we're called to in these verses we're looking at this morning. I mean, you read these verses, beginning with Matthew 5, verse 38, and you go all the way down to verse 48, and you wonder, is Jesus serious? Is he saying what I think he's saying? Well, follow along. I'm going to read those verses, picking it up at Matthew 5, verse 38. Matthew 5, verse 38, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." Now, are there any volunteers this morning that might come up and see what happens when I strike you in the face? If you raise your hand, I don't really trust you. A pastor one Sunday was speaking on turning the other cheek, and he stressed the importance of never trying to get even. Well, that afternoon, the youngest boy in the family came into the house crying, and between sobs, he told his mother how he had kicked his brother, and his brother had kicked him back in return. Well, I'm sorry that you're hurt, the mother said, but you can't go around kicking people. The tearful child replied, "I know, but the preacher said he wasn't supposed to kick me back." So that's what we kind of hope, that you get it. What do you do when you've been kicked? What do you do when you've been hurt? Hurt by someone's biting sarcasm. Hurt by someone's silence. Hurt by a friend's betrayal. Hurt by someone else's mistreatment. Hurt by someone's lack of appreciation. How do we respond when things just aren't fair? I Googled this past week the phrase, "when life's not fair," and it yielded 525 million results. It's on a lot of people's minds. Well, he continues, verse 40. "If someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles." Now, Jesus makes his point by using 3 illustrations: when hurt, when defrauded, when humiliated. We're going to see this in a moment. And then these 3 illustrations all culminate with verse 42. 3 negatives are summed up in a positive. Jesus says, verse 42, "Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you." You might be thinking, well, this might be a good time to ask my parents for an increase in my allowance. They'll have to give me a little bit more if I ask for it. Maybe you're thinking, well, this might be a good time to ask for $5,000 for that hot tub from some friend. Well, not so fast. We're going to come back to this. Look at verse 43. It's not getting any easier, by the way. You get to verse 43, and Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be the sons of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." And theologians speak of this as common grace. Verse 46, "If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Now listen, we can't reach that perfection on our own. That's the point. We're forced to throw ourselves under God's grace and mercy and His righteousness, and then God starts moving us toward that goal. But don't try and get there on your own, because you can't. That's what He's setting up here. But when we read such shocking statements of these verses here, in verses 38 through 48, there are kind of 2 immediate reactions, and I just want to speak to this quickly. There are 2 immediate reactions. One is to kind of tame Jesus' words. We kind of read this, and we instinctively, we want to qualify what Jesus says, and we start to explain away the force of Jesus' words. Listen, don't do that. Don't do it. Let these words shock you a bit. Sit in that place where it makes us all feel a little uncomfortable. Don't explain it all the way so it loses its punch. That's one reaction. Another reaction, sort of the other extreme, I guess, is to practice something that Jesus never intended. Be careful not to turn these principles into rules. That is the very thing Jesus was confronting. The Pharisees had their rules, but missed the intent of those rules, the heart of the matter. And what we see in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is a window into his heart. What does Jesus value, and what should citizens of the eternal kingdom value? What does it look like when we live under the rule of Jesus? Now, here's the main thought. So I don't want to be lost in all the particulars and the tough questions that might already be coming into your mind. Here's the main thought. When we live under the rule of Jesus, we think differently about our rights. When we live under the rule of Jesus, we think differently about our rights. Now, if our time this morning in these verses stirs us to relax our grip a little bit more on our own rights, then this sermon this morning has begun its work on us. When we live under the rule of Jesus, we think differently about our rights. And so the question on the table, that's for me as well as everyone in this room, is will you invite God to loosen that grip a little bit this morning? That's Jesus' point. That's our takeaway this morning. How tight is your grip on your rights? Well, let's put that to the test. Test number one, when hurt, do you retaliate? When hurt, do you retaliate? That's test number one, whether your grip is tight on your rights. When hurt, do you retaliate? Look at verse 38. Verse 38 again. Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. Now Gandhi said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Kind of true. Eye for eye and tooth for tooth. Old Testament law. It was taken from Exodus chapter 21, verses 23 through 27, and it was necessary for civil governments. This law that was given in the Old Testament was to establish a legal and judicial system under a theocracy that was being misused by the Pharisees. See, the purpose of this law is that the punishment inflicted should correspond in degree to the offense. It was intended to eliminate violence from escalating. That was its point. The whole point of this Old Testament command was to prevent people from the natural tendency to do more damage in retaliation. Because isn't that how retaliation works? I mean, if we're honest. We don't just give the other person an equal share of what we have experienced. We add to it. We over-retaliate. Oh, okay, you hurt me. You hurt me, I'm going to now hurt you. Matter of fact, I'm going to hurt you more than you hurt me. I'm going to go tell everybody about it, and I'm even going to embellish it a little bit. That's what I'm going to do. Because I don't want you to mess with me. That's what we're saying. We're all familiar, right, with the Hatfields and McCoys. There's quite a family feud, not talking about the game show. Though I heard I read that the families did actually appear on that game show in 1979. But these two rural families of the West Virginia and Kentucky area back in the 1800s had a perpetual on and off again squabble. Hatfields and the McCoys really are synonymous with revenge. There were many incidents that kept that feud going between these two families. There was a courtship between a Hatfield and a McCoy that inflamed the situation. One of the McCoys signing up and enlisting in the Union Army during the Civil War, that fanned the flame, and they went back at it with each other. There are many sparks that escalated the violence, and through it all, over a dozen lives were killed. Can you believe it? And you ask, well, how did it all begin? How did it all begin? Well, the story is told that it all began over a pig. Yes, a pig. There was a dispute about the ownership of a hog. Now, we kind of shake our heads at that. But consider the trivial nature of the things that separate us, that have torn apart relationships. It's almost like that, if we really stop and think about it. See, our tendency as fallen, sinful beings is for retaliation and revenge over sometimes a trivial matter that it goes so far down the road you even forget what it began with. You ever seen that happen? See, one act of retaliation provokes a greater act of retaliation, which provokes a greater act of retaliation, and you have revenge. The eye for eye and tooth for tooth law was in place to limit the evil done and to maintain order. The punishment was to fit the crime exactly. It upheld justice. Now, by Jesus' day, the Pharisees had completely abused this law and conveniently used it as a mandate for vengeance. You have a right to do this, and you should carry it out. The law that was intended for exacting punishment for evil was distorted to allow and even promote limited revenge. This law never gave a license for an individual to get revenge, even in a limited sense. You see, what is revenge and retaliation all about anyway? It's all about satisfying our own lust for anger, is it not? Well, Jesus corrects their understanding and misuse of exacting revenge. He says, don't resist an evil person. Now, it's worth noting here that the passage is singular, not plural. It's singular, not plural. Jesus is speaking to people as individuals and not addressing the role of civil governments. This principle of non-resistance does not apply to governmental authorities or war strikes, but it's speaking to personal relationships. This is not speaking to pacifism or about all forms of self-defense. These are not words to how a government should function. Jesus is telling us how we are to respond to personal attacks, personal hurt. When hurt, we are not to respond in kind. That's the example he gives here, verse 39. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Now, whether the striker is using the back of his hand to slap the right cheek or this is a punch to the jaw, it doesn't really matter. Because either way, the focus is on how we react. You see, under Jesus' rule, there is no place for retaliation or revenge. No place. Now, immediately, our minds start going to questions like, well, does this mean it's never appropriate to evade harm or protect ourselves from someone hurting us? Is that what he's saying? Does this mean that a person should remain in a situation where they're being physically abused? Does this mean we should never press charges or step in to help someone else who's being harmed? And on it goes with all the questions. Citizens of heaven, don't make people pay back for wronging us, but we do not need to keep letting them wrong us. Jesus isn't suggesting at all that we become someone's punching bag. That misses the point. The principle has to do with our rights. We may have a right to retaliate, but it doesn't mean we have to use that right. We need to loosen our grip. Now, perhaps for you, it isn't sticks and stones at all, but words that have hurt you. You might have been slapped in the face with harsh words. You may have felt a punch to the gut when someone spoke lies about you to others. You may be here this morning crushed because someone you thought of as a friend made you look bad. You might be here today hurt because you didn't get the recognition that you thought you deserved. How tight is your grip on your rights? All I want you to ask. Is there someone who's hurt you? Perhaps someone's still hurting you? Until you have that person in mind, you have not really understood Jesus' words. How are you going to respond out of your hurts? Or can you trust God with it? In 1 Peter, it says, and trust ourselves to our Creator who judges justly. Can we trust God with that? With our Creator? Can we trust it to Him? When hurt, will you retaliate? That's the first test. Second test is when defrauded, are you possessive about your possessions? Are you possessive about your possessions? Jack Benny loved to tell the story of a time when he was attacked by a mugger. The mugger would come to him and say, "Your money or your life?" Then there was a brief silence. The mugger says, well, your money or your life? And Benny says, "Don't rush me. I'm thinking." I'm thinking. Now, there's someone who had a tight grip on his possessions. Verse 40. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. Really? Now, this isn't speaking to robbery, but to a lawsuit. And it's difficult to know the exact nature of this lawsuit. We're not given a lot of information here. Is it legal claim someone has, or is someone trying to take advantage of someone else? We don't really know. It's up for grabs. What we do know about lawsuits in Jesus' day is that if someone had no possessions and were poor, they would use their clothing as collateral. And after a certain time, the payment due the lender wasn't paid, he could rightfully keep his tunic. Now, a tunic was the clothing over the skin. It was the shirt, likened to that. It was our shirts. We might look at it that way. And the poor person, would then have, if he gave his shirt, would only have the cloak. That coat was even used as a blanket to keep them warm at night. Now, Old Testament law, you can look it up in Exodus 22, Old Testament law prohibited taking another person's cloak, the coat, the outer garment. The cloak was recognized by Jewish law to be an inalienable possession. It was theirs and no one could take it. Now, we might not think of this really a big deal about giving someone else my coat. I have 3 more of them at home. They didn't have closets full of clothing like we do today. It would be a big deal. Jesus' stunning word for his followers was, if someone rightfully or wrongfully takes your shirt, it doesn't matter. Be as willing to go as far as giving him your only coat, giving him your prized possession. Kingdom citizens who have the mind of Christ say, "Oh, you want my shirt? Fine, take my coat as well." And you go, "Well, that sounds absurd." Now be careful not to do what the Pharisees would do and make this into a law or a rule. He's not saying that if someone comes along and asks something from us, we're required to give them something else in addition to that. Remember, Jesus is after our attitude. Our attitude. How possessive are we about our possessions? An attitude. This is really tested when we don't think the other person deserves anything in the first place. But listen, aren't people more important than possessions? Isn't that Jesus saying that? Is there a situation right now in your life that you're being called to loosen your grip on something that is rightfully yours for the sake of a relationship? How tight a grip do you have on your possessions? Third test. The answer, how tight? Third test. When humiliated, how far are you willing to go? How far are you willing to go? Verse 41, it's challenging to find a contemporary equivalent. It says, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Now, Roman law said that if a Roman soldier asked a citizen to carry his luggage, that citizen would be obligated to carry it, but not to exceed 1,000 paces, which was roughly 1 mile. This was think about it, this was a tremendous inconvenience for the civilian, for he had to stop what he was doing and stop where he was going to carry this soldier's equipment. But he had no choice. He had to do it. But more than it being inconvenient, it was humiliating for the Jewish civilian. Listen, this isn't about stopping to help your wife carrying in the groceries. This isn't about helping somebody move into a new house. No, it was for someone you couldn't stand. Because no Jew would want to help Romans. They despised the Romans, and so how humiliating to stop and serve a hated Roman. Think of someone you really struggle with to make your application here. Because Jesus says the unthinkable again. He says, okay, 1,000 paces, that's fine. That's ordinary. I want you to go 2,000 paces. That's 2 miles. Carry the luggage of a hated Roman an additional mile. Jesus calls us to be second-mile Christians. The first mile is to meet our obligation. That's minimum living. The way of Christ is to do more than just your duty. Go a second mile. Now, we have to start asking, how do I apply this to my life? Well, you might consider where you have drawn that line in the sand. Is it 1 mile or is it 2? Don't be legalistic about the 2. That misses the principle. I mean, you might have said, I don't have to take that from you. I've given you another chance. That's it. Here's my line in the sand. I will not go any further than this. You might have a right to say that. You've met every right and obligation. You've met the requirement, but I'm just going to ask you, is God calling you to go further? Will you dare to be extraordinary? How far am I willing to go? Now here's something we can count on, that our Lord Jesus will walk the extra mile with us. We just might find that as we step out of our little comfort zone and in obedience go further than we feel we can go, and it be an extraordinary that we discover that the joy of the Lord's presence is with us in a very powerful way. We might find that because we're not doing that, we're missing out on the indescribable joy because we're only doing what we can do 1 mile. And if we step outside of that and say, I'm going to do more than what I can do, I need to rely on the power of God to do it in me and through me, that we'll just experience something totally different. It might blow us away. See, it's the second mile that will force us to throw ourselves upon the Lord and His grace. That's His point. I can do 1 mile. 2, it's going to take more than just me. And we see this bar and we go, really? That's what Jesus is asking of us? Well, He has a right to ask this of us, doesn't He? He was humiliated. He was oppressed. He was afflicted. He endured the limitations of humanity for us. He considered our needs over His own. Did He not go the extra mile for us? He gave up His rights for us. Should we relax our grip a bit more on our own rights? And you know what? When we loosen our grip, we can do that because we are secure in His grip, right? Fourth test. There's only 20 of them, so we're getting there. I'm only kidding. It's not 20. Go the extra mile with me here. Fourth test. When there's a need to be met, do you lean towards generosity? We're going to just hit this one quickly. Verse 42, Jesus says, give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, the common teaching was to only give to those who are family or extended family, and even then, just the minimum. And Jesus goes after that thinking, and He removes all the restrictions. We're not to only give to those we know, and there are no limits on our giving. Just give. Again, do not make this a law. Are there times that it would be unwise to give and give and give to the one who asks? Absolutely. Use wisdom. We need wisdom. But you notice here, Jesus doesn't concern Himself with the exceptions. What is our attitude when it comes to our possessions? We say, I have a right to my possessions. I have a right to my money. I've earned it. I have a right to all my stuff. Am I willing to give generously to those in need? Generous people don't stand on their rights. How tight is our grip on our rights? You see, Jesus, all the way through this, He's confronting this me mindset. Because instead of asking what's in it for me or what can I get out of it, the question ought to be, what do others need? That's what he's driving at. One living under the rule of Jesus is more concerned about others than he is about his own rights. Now, all of what Jesus just said rolls out in what he says next. This whole matter of our personal rights and our response of personal sacrifice for the sake of others fits under the final words of this chapter. Here's the final test. You'd be glad to hear that. When hated, do you love anyway? This is a tough one. When hated, do you love anyway? This is one of those impossible scriptures. Verse 44, Jesus tells us, love our enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, Jesus is correcting another misunderstanding taught by the Pharisees. The Pharisees spoke of loving your neighbor, but they had a very narrow view of neighbor. It was exclusive to include only those on the inside, those who were part of your group, your brothers. Those were your neighbors. And by extension, if it was not, you were not part of that inner group, everyone else outside that group you could hate. And nowhere does Scripture say, as was commonly taught, that we are to hate our enemies. Jesus comes along and he says, love our enemies. He says, pray for our enemies. Is there someone, and this is what I had to ask myself, is there someone that I really struggle with? What does Jesus say? Pray for them. I'm not talking about the imprecatory prayers, if you know what I mean. God, get them for what they're doing. Not those kind of prayers. I mean, you can pray that God changes their heart. Nothing wrong with that. You can pray that God deals with them in his way. But isn't it difficult to pray for someone and hate them at the same time? Any enemies? Pastor asked his congregation, how many of you have enemies? And quite a few people raised their hands. Okay, now raise your hands if you have only a few enemies. And half the people raised their hands. He said, now raise your hand if you have only one or two enemies. And just a few people raised their hands. He was on a roll, so he kept going. He said, now raise your hand if you have no enemies at all. He figured you wouldn't see anybody raise their hand, but the pastor looked around the room, and way in the back was a very old man who raised his hand. You have no enemies? The pastor asked this old man, no, I have no enemies whatsoever, he said. So the pastor invited this man up to the front. He says, what a blessing. No enemies. How old are you? And he says, I'm 98 years old and I have no enemies. Wow, the pastor exclaims. Just tell me, how do you do it? I mean, how is it that you have no enemies? And he answered, all of them have died. At 98, we can get rid of our enemies. Have any enemies? Who might be your enemy? Our enemy might be the one who opposes us because we love and we serve Jesus. Yes, he talks about that, persecution. Our enemy might be the one who kind of snubs us every time they see us. Our enemy might be the one who brought harm to a loved one, or our enemy might be the one who publicly humiliated us. Our enemy might be the one who walked off with something precious of ours, or they won't speak to us, or they hurt us deeply with words, and they continue to hurt us. Can you love that person? Not just give lip service to it. Could you do an act of love for that person? Because he's not talking about feelings. He's talking about an act of love. Can you do an act of love for that person? Can I? See, to love someone who loves us, it's not that unusual. But to love someone who's out to get us, or someone who makes our lives miserable, or less than a joyous experience, that takes something extraordinary. I mean, what's so great about loving when we get something in return? See, love with strings attached, it's not love. That's a business transaction. Is there someone you're giving a cold shoulder to because you didn't get what you wanted from them? What act of love is God calling you to toward an enemy? Toward someone who's trying to make your life difficult? How do you treat those who go against you, who make your life just so challenging, those who oppose you, who give you nothing in return? We might think, I have a right to be treated differently. You have no right to treat me this way. I don't deserve this. Okay. I'm not going to argue that. The question is, how tight of a grip do you have on your rights? Remember the takeaway. When we live under the rule of Jesus, we think differently about our rights. Now, if we're honest, we would have to admit that the reason we struggle with a section of Scripture is mostly because we are more committed to our own well-being than others' interests. We struggle with all this that we just read here this morning because we have bought what the world says, and even some maybe well-intentioned Christians have told us about protecting what is ours, looking out for ourselves, and standing up for our rights. Now, I'm not suggesting we should never stand up for any of our rights. But I'm going to go to the radical side, this hyperbole side of this as Jesus is going. Because what makes this passage so difficult to swallow is our strong commitment to our inalienable rights. Let's be honest about that. It's not doctrinal. It's not the exceptions. We're a society most obsessed with rights. So we have children's rights, workers' rights, women's rights, prisoners' rights, animal rights, smokers' rights, and rights for every interest group out there. And the courtrooms are bogged down with ridiculous lawsuits in the name of rights, justice, and vengeance. When self-interest rules, it opens a way for revenge to replace justice. I hope you struggle with this. That's the point. As Oswald Sanders put it, the master expects from his disciples such conduct as can be explained only in terms of the supernatural. In other words, dare to be extraordinary. There was a Chinese Christian man who owned a rice paddy next to one owned by a communist man. And the Christian man diligently irrigated his rice paddy by pumping water out of a canal by using one of those leg-operated pumps. It was hard work to get water out of that. But every day, after the Christian spent time and effort pumping enough water to fill his field, the communist neighbor would come out, remove some boards that kept the water in the Christian's field, and let all the water flow down into his own fields. That way he didn't have to pump. This continued day after day after day. In exasperation, the Christian cried out to the Lord, if this keeps up, I'm going to lose all my rice, maybe even my field. I've got a family to care for. What can I do? Well, later that day, a thought occurred to him, and so the very next morning, he rose much earlier than usual in the pre-dawn hours of darkness, and he started pumping water into the field of his communist neighbor. Then he replaced the boards and he pumped water into his own rice paddy. He did this day after day after day. And in a few weeks, both fields of rice were doing well. The communist was puzzled, and he asked this very question: what kind of person does this? What kind of person does this? Now, the story goes on to speak of this communist man converting to Christ. But the question that started all of it is, what kind of person does this? What kind of person would do this act of kindness to a stealing neighbor? One who lives under the rule of Jesus. One who thinks differently about his rights. Church, don't just do the ordinary thing. Dare to be extraordinary. Dare to be extraordinary in the week to come.